Where do we begin? Long, long, long ago, there was a supercontinent called Pangaea, and... No, that's way too far back. Several thousands of years ago, when the sea levels were lower thanks to glaciers, a group of humans crossed over from Asia to North America on the Bering Land Bridge, and... No, that's not right either. How about... The year is 1492, and an Italian man named Christopher Columbus has just landed in the Caribbean, establishing the beginning of what would be long-lasting contact between the Americas and Europe, as well as opening up the floodgates on a new age of European exploration in the Americas, as Europeans seek out land and opportunity to conquer in the name of their home countries. That was probably worth mentioning. It's certainly getting us closer to where we need to be. How about 1519? Up on the island of Newfoundland is a port known as St. John's, where English fishermen have been illegally fishing alongside other European ships. It's not a proper settlement, but it is, from a certain point of view, the first English outpost. No, this doesn't feel right either. It's not an official outpost, and the English haven't even started to make official outposts yet in the New World. Well, you know what? How about we start there? September of 1583. It's a stormy night as two English ships are struggling to cross the Atlantic Ocean. They are the HMS Squirrel and the HMS Golden Hind. They're tiny ships and aren't meant to be making a transatlantic crossing. The Squirrel is loaded up with so many cannons that it feels like it could break apart at any moment. The captain of the Squirrel is a man named Sir Humphrey Gilbert, the most stereotypical English aristocrat who ever lived. The Squirrel was Sir Gilbert's personal ship, and he wanted to load it up with as much cannons as possible, and then some. A few days earlier, Gilbert even stepped on a nail that had broken loose from the creaking ship. Throughout this perilous voyage, the crew of the ship had been trying to convince Gilbert to stay on the other ship, the Golden Hind, as they believed that the Squirrel was going to be destroyed on the voyage, but the nobleman refused to be separated from his favorite boat. Instead, he locked himself up in his quarters reading a book, refusing to listen to his crew. The ships are on a return trip to England, but as they near Portugal, the two ships enter a terrible storm. Sir Gilbert looks at the storm and then to the Golden Hind, understanding that, well, he was going to die, pointing up to the sky and saying, "We are as near to heaven by sea as by land." The Squirrel sank and Sir Humphrey Gilbert died in the Atlantic Ocean, just like many other ships of this time. The Golden Hind managed to make its way back to England, where it reported the situation to Queen Elizabeth I herself. That's right, Gilbert had been on a state mission from the Queen. You see, Europe had entered a race to colonize the newly discovered Americas, and England still did not have a single outpost on any of the two continents. Queen Elizabeth had dispatched Sir Gilbert to formally take over St. John's in Newfoundland to establish the very foundation of this overseas British Empire. Indeed, Gilbert went to the port and claimed the area. He even had a little party with the sailors and was gifted a dog by one of the people at the port, which was apparently a thing you did back then. The problem was that barely anybody lived at St. John's. Again, it was an outpost and not a permanent settlement. Gilbert had set sail back to England to get supplies so that he could establish a permanent settlement in Newfoundland, which brought us to his death. Why did Queen Elizabeth send someone as incompetent as the prissy Sir Gilbert? She did so because Sir Gilbert was the half-brother to a man named Sir Walter Raleigh. Which begs the question, who was Sir Walter Raleigh? Well, first we need to get into Queen Elizabeth's predecessor, Queen Mary. You know, it's hard to really get a nice, clean American history story going since there really is no clean place to start. I apologize for the front-loading of this information. Queen Mary was a Catholic who despised Protestants, which was too bad for Sir Raleigh because he and his whole family were Protestants. They managed to escape death on more than one occasion from Mary's staunch anti-Protestant policies. Thankfully for the Raleighs, Elizabeth I succeeded Mary, and Elizabeth was much more pro-Protestant, allowing the Raleigh family to rest for a little bit. But Raleigh still despised Catholics and wanted revenge for the terror they inflicted upon him. At the time, the neighboring country of France was a Catholic nation dealing with a rebellion by their Protestants, called Huguenots. Walter Raleigh went to France and fought against the Catholics himself, so, as you can tell, the adventuring mercenary Walter Raleigh is much different than his pampered half-brother Humphrey Gilbert's. When Catholic Spanish and Italians began to support anti-English revolts done by the Catholics in English-dominated Ireland, Raleigh went over there to fight against them too, leading a sort of death squad unit that beheaded 600 Spanish and Italian soldiers. Raleigh was a hero and had proven his loyalty to the Protestant and English cause. As such, Raleigh had been put in command of overseeing English interest in Ireland, mainly forcing Irish people out of their homes to make way for more English people. Raleigh was eventually approached by Queen Elizabeth to be put in charge of creating an English colony in America, due to it being a similar job to the colonization of Ireland. Which brings us back to 1583, where Raleigh has learned that his half-brother has died and the first efforts to formally establish a colony in America has failed. Raleigh needs a new plan. 1 year later. It's a nice, hot July on the uncolonized coast of North America. Let's take a look at the village of Roanoke, a village that is part of the Secaucus tribe and near the border with the Croatan tribe, a rival tribe. For years, the rival tribes had fought with each other and schemed against one another. But now, what's this coming by sea? Well, that would be a few ships carrying some English people. Over in England, Raleigh has kicked himself into gear and has sent colonists to find any place on the North American continent to settle. In fact, Queen Elizabeth has told him that if he fails, he'll lose permission to ever make a colony again. So, in a last-ditch effort, Raleigh has sent out some colonists to try to do something. And so, they arrived at Roanoke. As the English touched down, the dynamics of the Croatans and the Secaucans have changed. The Secaucans have to deal with the fact that these people from across the ocean just showed up in the middle of their nation and are coming on in. The Croatans are pleased by this, since the Secaucans have been a thorn in their side for who knows how long. Long story short, the Secaucans end up hating the English, while the Croatans think they're pretty swell. Now, this mission in July isn't really a colonizing one, but a mission to get a lay of the land. Two Croatans by the name of Monteo and Manchese probably. No one in God's earth would call themselves man-cheese. Monteo and Manchese come along with the English and return to England, where they meet Raleigh himself, teaching Raleigh about the geography and politics of the area so the English know what they're getting into. Remoralized by this, Raleigh organizes a mission to colonize the area and make Roanoke, as the English called it, a new territory in the English Empire, and the first proper English outpost on the American continent. In command of this effort to colonize Roanoke is a man named Richard Grenville, a nobleman who is a bit more of a Raleigh than a Gilbert, if you know what I mean. Grenville is a mercenary, a politician, and a warrior who spent much of his younger years on the battlefield pushing back the Muslim Turks away from Christian Hungary, the regular remove kebab deus vult kind of guy. And so, after a year of preparation, Grenville sets off with his fleet, where he captains the HMS Tiger. The Croatan Manteo is on board for his return trip as well. Because crossing the Atlantic was dangerous, Grenville tells his fleet that if they get lost or separated, they need to meet him in around the Spanish colony of Puerto Rico. Sure enough, they don't get far until a storm hits, in which the Tiger loses contact with every single ship in the fleet. So the Tiger goes off to Puerto Rico and just waits. While waiting, Grenville spends time making friendly relationships with the Spanish who are colonizing the island. And while he's having nice diplomacy with the Spanish in public, in private he goes off on the Tiger and casually raids Spanish ships. As time goes on, he gets bored and just casually builds an entire fort. Finally, one of his ships makes it to Puerto Rico, but by this point in time, Grenville was so bored of waiting that he didn't care about waiting for the others. So, he dismantled the fort before he and the other ship set sail for Roanoke. One thing to note is that the area containing Roanoke Island is a particularly dangerous area of the coast that will one day be called the Graveyard of the Atlantic for how dangerous it is to traverse. Grenville will learn this when he enters the Ocracoke Inlet and hits a shoal that causes a massive hole to open up in the Tiger that ruins all of their food rations. The crew managed to repair the ship, but there was a bit of a food crisis. As the Tiger continued, they discovered 2 more ships further up the coast. Turns out that they were ships that were part of Grenville's fleet that got lost in the storm. The captains apparently didn't know about the Puerto Rico plan or something because they were just waiting for Grenville out in the sea near Roanoke. In fact, there was supposed to be 3 ships here. One of them got so tired of waiting on Grenville that the captain dropped off his passengers with the other ships and just sailed up to Newfoundland to become a pirate. But, with the exception of that one renegade captain, Grenville had his whole fleet together, and so they landed at Roanoke and established a small English settlement, while Grenville went out with some men and explored the area, making contact with various Secretan and Croatan towns. Things go generally well until someone from the Secretan village of Aquascagok steals a silver cup that the English brought over. Grenville goes to Aquascagok with Manteo as his translator, but because Manteo was a Croatan, the Secretans refused to speak with them. An argument burst out in the town between the Secretans and the English, and it turned into a heated debate. Well, when I say heated, I mean the English burned down Aquascagok. This naturally pissed off the Secretans. So, let's talk about Roanoke. Roanoke was supposed to be just one town of a larger English colony. The Queen, Elizabeth, was known to be the Virgin Queen as she never married and never had children. In fact, she had proclaimed that she was married to England. Raleigh had ordered Roanoke to be the first settlement in the wider English colony that would be called Virginia. Although today Roanoke isn't in Virginia, but you get the idea. Roanoke was running low on supplies, especially considering the Tiger had lost a large chunk of the food supply. Grenville looked at the situation in Roanoke and decided to return to England for more men and supplies. He tells the English to stay and maintain the colony while he returns to England, informing them that he will return in less than a year. And so Grenville left out to sea, leaving behind his colony. And then a year passed, and Grenville didn't come back, which left the English in Roanoke confused. They didn't have much food supplies with them, and the Secretans had noticed that Grenville didn't come back as well. Understanding this as England abandoning the settlers, the Secretans launched an attack which the settlers only just managed to repel. At this point, the Roanoke English began working much closer with the friendly Croatans, of which Manteo was now the chief. With this exchange, the colonists learned how to grow things like tobacco, corn, and potatoes. One day, some English ships finally appear at Roanoke, but it was not Grenville, but a man named Sir Francis Drake. And oh boy, was Drake a personality. It took great courage to set sail across the Atlantic Ocean and try to settle in North America, but it took even more courage to set sail across the Atlantic Ocean, circumnavigating South America and landing in California to establish a colony, which is exactly what Drake did, landing in California and naming the region New Albion. He was also the second person ever to circumnavigate the entire planet, which is a trait of an absolute madman that got himself knighted by Queen Elizabeth herself. He had been exploring the ocean since he was in his 20s, sailing with his second cousin to Africa, stealing slaves from the Portuguese and destroying their ships, and then selling the slaves to the Spanish, technically making his actions serve as the first English participation in the African Atlantic slave trade. Not that he made slave trading his career choice or anything. In fact, he worked alongside a full group of freed African slaves from the French and helped them destroy some French outposts in Africa. But that was all in Drake's past. What is he doing here out by Roanoke? Well, Drake tells the colonists of what's been going down. It turns out war had broken out between Spain and England, the Anglo-Spanish War, and it's a big one. The war had already been underway when Grenville had first set sail a year ago, But back then, the war was a lot smaller and didn't really include America or the Atlantic Ocean. That had changed now. Now, the war had gotten out of control as it was revealed that Spain had the ambitions of fully taking over England, which would make it one of the most powerful countries in the world. The desperate struggle had meant that it was unsafe to cross the Atlantic Ocean, and Grenville was stuck in England. On top of that, every single capable ship in England was ordered to be used for the war effort. Drake had taken the opportunity of war to go down and beat up the Spanish in the Caribbean, launching what he called the Great Expedition, because of course he called it that. With small groups of soldiers, Drake plundered Spanish territories in Africa, Colombia, and Florida, all Spanish possessions that crippled Spanish maritime infrastructure in the area. The Spanish had actually come to refer to him as the nefarious pirate El Draque, with King Philip II of Spain himself putting a bounty on his head that comes out to around $8 million today. But yeah, Drake had just crippled an empire and was about to return home when he remembered he heard something about his country making a colony up north, and he decided to check up on it. And that brings us here when Drake arrived at the dying Roanoke colony. He provided them with more resources to hold themselves over, but also told them to come with him if they wanted to live. And so, a large chunk of the Roanoke colony population decided to come with Drake as he went back to England. Drake made it back home, where he sailed into Portsmouth, where English lined the streets and welcomed him as a hero. Not only did Drake come back after crippling the Spanish Empire in the New World, but he also brought maize, tobacco, and potatoes to England, the potato becoming the signature food in much of modern European cuisine, changing the diets of Europeans forever. Oh, and not long afterwards, Drake would help lead English forces that crushed a massive Spanish armada that was going to invade England. No biggie. Grenville, meanwhile, had been trying his best to get a ride to Roanoke, which he finally did, arriving in Roanoke only to find it in a very sorry state after Drake had taken away so many colonists. This put Grenville in a pickle, as he had been hired to create a successful colony in North America, as Queen Elizabeth was becoming disillusioned with the idea of American colonization, especially after the death of Gilbert. In a decision made from desperation and rage, Grenville sent 15 soldiers from his boat to survive in the abandoned remains of Roanoke, so that Roanoke was still technically an English colony with English boots on the ground, thereby keeping Raleigh's charter valid. Grenville then left to return to England, although he didn't seem to have any intention on getting supplies for them. From appearances, it looks like Grenville left the men to die. This bothered Grenville's friend, a soft-spoken artist named John White, who was on board the ship. White was a curious type of guy who was allured to the New World because of the numerous new things that he could see and record. White may have let people walk all over him, but many people liked him. As for his art, he used watercolors rather than oil paintings like many other people from his time. He's interested in the New World for the art and for the sights of natural beauty and whatnot. He's not into it for the geopolitics or the treasures like his boss Raleigh. Speaking of, now that Grenville had given up on Roanoke, Raleigh had given up as well, and decided that it was better to create a new colony from scratch, specifically aiming to set up a colony in the Chesapeake Bay, further north. And so, Grenville giving up and instead deciding to focus on the war with Spain, Raleigh put the poor White in charge of colonization efforts, giving him 115 colonists and sending him off to make a settlement in the Chesapeake Bay that would still be considered part of the really not geographically well-defined colony of Virginia. So, White sets off with his ship, the HMS Lion. His navigator was a Portuguese man named Simon Fernandez, who wasn't really liked by the crew, who nicknamed him the Swine. Fernandez was actually once a pirate who attacked Spanish ships. He really hated Spain. Being a pirate, he also had a few run-ins with the English ships in his day, which eventually saw himself captured by England and set to be hanged. However, the Queen's spy master, Francis Walsingham, came to him to give him a second chance at life, allowing him to live on the condition that he became a Protestant and served the Queen since he was such a skilled navigator. And that he did. Now, Fernandez didn't really like his crew since, well, they didn't really like him. Pirate career and all that. He also seems to be upset that he's being used to ferry colonists from England to the Americas, when he thought that his talents were going to be used in combat against Spain in the Caribbean. While White was sailing to the New World for the first time since he abandoned the guards at Roanoke, he couldn't help but remember the men he saw as his friends who he left to die. White decided to make a stop at Roanoke before they would go to the Chesapeake Bay. Fernandez was stoked about this because that would make their course go further south, and if the captain was willing to go further south, then maybe he'd let him go all the way to the Caribbean to fight the Spanish, eh? And so, the Lion arrived at Roanoke, and everyone gets out while Fernandez stays on the Lion as he is the navigator. White takes a look at Roanoke and can't find anyone. They only find one skeleton in destroyed buildings. Spooked, White turns the party around to go back to the Lion, but finds that Fernandez isn't letting them back on. Fernandez yells at them about how he didn't want to go north to the Chesapeake and wanted to fight in the south instead. He didn't want anyone stepping on that ship until they agreed to fight in the Caribbean. Naturally, none of the colonists were trained in naval warfare, so nobody agreed, and White was like, well, guess we live here now. So the settlers unloaded and began to repair Roanoke. White went around drawing pictures and maps and looking for clues for what happened to the men they left behind. Eventually, White ran into Chief Montejo of the Croatans. Montejo explained that the Secretans had launched an attack, killed the guards, and ransacked the village. The Secretans also refused to speak to White. While the colonists wanted revenge for the Secretan attack, White wasn't really sure that was necessary. He managed to keep the colonists down for a time until one day a colonist was killed by an Indian while looking for crabs on the beach. The colonists are enraged by this and plan on attacking the nearest Secretan town, Dasamongapunki. Giving into the pressure from the colonists, White agreed to lead an attack on Dasamongapunki. They snuck into the village early in the morning while it was still dark and attacked the natives. However, as they attacked, they realized that they messed up. The village they were attacking was not the Secretan village of Dasamongapunki, but a Croatan village. The disaster ended any goodwill between the English and the Croatans. Now the settlement of Roanoke was truly alone, with no allies. About 10 days later, White became a grandfather when his daughter gave birth. This healthy child was the first English person to be born in the Americas. Because she was born in the colony of Virginia, she was named Virginia Dare. Things only go downhill from here. The colonists realized that since they set up their colony in Roanoke instead of the Chesapeake Bay, the planned English supply ships weren't coming since they wouldn't go to Roanoke. White didn't want to leave his colony behind, but the colonists eventually pressured him into going to England. White was paranoid as it seemed like every time a colonial governor left Roanoke, they would return to find the colony abandoned. He gave them instructions to carve a Maltese cross into a tree if they had to leave the colony by force. He also made them promise to keep his things safe while he was gone. He then set off to England. However, as White returned to England, the Anglo-Spanish War was still going on, and it was still incredibly difficult to get a ship over to America. He was stuck in England for a few months until he finally got 2 vessels to set sail to Roanoke with some supplies. However, as they set sail, the 2 captains were distracted by a small Spanish fleet and decided to attack them for their goods. This didn't go as planned as the Spanish defeated them, taking the supplies meant for Roanoke and sending the 2 robbed ships back out with no supplies. White just ordered the ships to go back to England. Later that year, Raleigh kind of felt bad for White and kept trying to find a way to get ships for him. As Raleigh was asking permission for ships from Queen Elizabeth, however, the massive Spanish Armada launched an attack on England, and so you get a huge naval battle right by England with Drake doing his thing. It just wasn't a really good time to send ships out to go colonize America. 2 years later. The Anglo-Spanish War is still going on, and it will keep going on for 14 more years. Raleigh is stuck trying to organize raids on the Spanish Navy. Nobody in England has any hopes for America. White isn't like Grenville, though. He's not going to give up. Grenville didn't have his family in America, now did he? White eventually just wants to see Roanoke and check in on everyone. Raleigh hitches him a ride on a ship captained by John Watts, who has been leading raids on the Spanish Navy in the New World. After some good old-fashioned privateering, Watts agrees to stop by Roanoke. They arrive in August on what would be Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday. White finally lands, searching for his family and his colony after 3 long years of desperately trying to get to them. And nobody is there. There's no sign of a struggle or a battle. There's not even a sign of a colony. Where all the houses once stood, there was nothing. Each building must have been dismantled, but nobody carved a Maltese cross on any tree. On one post that once outlined the colony, carved was the word Croatoan, an alternate spelling for Croatan. And on a nearby tree was carved C-R-O, and that was it. After looking around, White found where the colonists were keeping the stuff he made them promise to keep safe. They were evidently buried, but had at some point been unburied. As he describes from his journal, "About the place, many of my things spoiled and broken, and my books torn from the covers. The frames of some of my pictures and maps rotten and spoiled with rain, and my armor almost eaten through with rust." White theorized that at some point after the colony was abandoned, some native tribe had somehow found his things and looted them. But White was full of despair and wanted to search for his family and the colony immediately. But the weather had become worse. Bad weather already saw the ships lose 3 anchors, and they were already on their last. A reluctant White returned to the ship and returned to England. After the tragedy, Raleigh allowed White to stay in his palace in Ireland, where he was pretty much depressed all his life. He never stopped hoping that his family was still alive. Raleigh would give up efforts to colonize America and instead began expeditions into South America that he himself went on. The expeditions were not to establish a colony, but to take the gold of the mythical city of El Dorado. He would end up being involved in attacks against Spain after the Anglo-Spanish War had concluded, putting the new peace between the two countries at risk. He would be beheaded in England for these crimes. Before his death, Raleigh had sent a few missions to try to find out what happened to Roanoke. One mission had to turn back due to bad weather. Another got lost and was killed by an unknown native tribe after crashing somewhere on the East Coast, only survived by their captain. During the Anglo-Spanish War, Spain received reports that Roanoke was a thriving military outpost and deployed forces to destroy it, only to find it in its abandoned state. And such was the story of the first English settlement in America. Maybe it just wasn't meant to be. But nearly 20 years later, the eastern coast of the North American continent was once more approached by mysterious ships, landing a few men who planted the white and red flag of England, St. George's Cross, in the sand. Roanoke may have been the beginning, but it was not the end.